Seattle's streets grew deadly silent as ice began falling from the sky. Not snow, hail. The kind that shattered windshields and sent people scrambling for cover. But 10-year-old Dahlia Brooks stood frozen on the corner of Jackson Street, her colorful hair beads clicking together as she looked up at the darkening sky with wonder instead of fear. She shouldn't have been outside. Her mama always said to come straight home when the sky turned that particular shade of bruised purple, but the streetlights had just flickered on, painting everything in amber, and Dahlia had wanted just 5 more minutes of not being alone in their quiet apartment. The first chunk of ice hit the pavement 3 feet away, exploding like a gunshot. Then another. Then a dozen more, nature's violence accelerating into a lethal downpour. Dahlia's breath caught. She tried to run, but her worn sneakers slipped on the suddenly slick concrete. That's when she saw him. A tall man in an expensive suit, white shirt open at the throat despite the cold, a fierce tiger tattooed across his neck. Their eyes met for a split second, his dark and dangerous, hers wide with the particular terror of a child who suddenly understood she might die. He moved like lightning, and everything changed. Kang Min-soo had built an empire on reading danger before it struck. 20 years in Seattle's underground had sharpened his instincts to a razor's edge. He could sense a rival's betrayal from 3 blocks away, could smell a federal surveillance operation in the shift of shadows, but he'd never expected his gut to scream at him over a child. He'd been leaving his legitimate business front, a high-end Korean restaurant on Jackson, when the sky had opened up with biblical fury. His driver had already pulled the Mercedes around. Min-soo had 1 foot toward the door when he spotted her. Small. Alone. Directly in the path of hailstones, the size of golf balls now pounding the street with enough force to crack skulls. He didn't think. Thinking was for business. This was pure instinct, the same reflex that had kept him alive through gang wars and federal investigations. Min-soo sprinted into the storm, his $700 shoes finding purchase on ice that would have sent anyone else sprawling. The girl had turned to run but slipped. Time seemed to slow as Min-soo watched a chunk of ice the size of his fist arc, directly toward her head. He reached her in 3 strides, yanking her against his chest and pivoting to shield her with his back. The impact hit his shoulder blade like a hammer. Then another struck his ribs. Pain exploded through his torso, but he gritted his teeth and stayed standing, 1 arm locked around the trembling child, the other raised to deflect what he could. His driver appeared with an umbrella, useless against this onslaught, but better than nothing. Together they made it to the car. Min-soo practically threw himself into the back seat, the girl still clutched against him, both of them gasping. For several seconds, neither moved. The hail hammered the Mercedes like automatic gunfire. Min-soo became aware of the tiny heartbeat racing against his chest, rapid as a trapped bird. Slowly, carefully, he loosened his grip. The girl pulled back, those enormous eyes, deep brown and startlingly intelligent, locked onto his face. She was shaking but not crying. Min-soo had seen grown men weep after less. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice small but steady. She pointed at his temple where a smaller stone had clipped him. Min-soo touched his forehead, fingers coming away red. He'd barely felt it. "I'm fine." The girl's gaze dropped to his neck, to the tiger tattoo that had earned him his street name. Horangi. Tiger. Her small body went rigid. "Mom warned me about you," she whispered. The words hit harder than the hail. Min-soo's jaw tightened. Of course, everyone in the Central District knew who he was, what he was. This child's mother had probably used him as a cautionary tale. Stay away from Jackson Street. Stay away from the Korean gangsters. Stay away from the man with the tiger on his throat. He should have felt nothing. He'd been called worse things by better people. But something in those eyes, fear mixed with confusion, because the monster who was supposed to hurt her had just taken hail to the spine to keep her safe, cut through defenses he didn't know he still had. "Your mother's smart," he said quietly. "You should listen to her." He reached for the door handle to let her out. The storm was easing, but the girl moved faster. Before Min-soo could process what was happening, small arms wrapped around his torso and a face pressed against his chest, right over his heart. She was hugging him. Min-soo froze. His arms hung uselessly at his sides. The last person who'd embraced him with genuine affection had been his grandmother, dead 15 years. Every touch since had carried calculation, seduction, intimidation, transaction. This was none of those things. "Thank you," the girl mumbled into his shirt, which was now soaked with melted ice and probably some of his blood. "You saved me." Something cracked in Min-soo's chest, a fissure in the armor he'd welded into place over decades. His hands moved of their own accord, one settling awkwardly on the child's back, the other hovering near her head with its colorful beads. He'd ordered executions with less hesitation. "What's your name?" The question escaped before he could stop it. "Dahlia." She pulled back just enough to look up at him. "Dahlia Brooks, what's yours?" A dozen lies queued up. Min-soo had more aliases than he had dress shirts, but looking into those trusting eyes, he found himself giving the truth. Kang Min-soo. Recognition didn't flicker across her face. She was too young to read Korean newspapers, too sheltered from the streets despite living on them. To her, he wasn't the head of the largest Korean crime syndicate on the West Coast. He was just the man who'd pulled her from the storm. "Can you take me home?" Dahlia asked. "I live in the apartments near Garfield High School. The blue ones." Min-soo knew the building, Section 8 housing, half the units in disrepair, the other half worse. He'd grown up in a place like that before clawing his way to penthouse views and offshore accounts. The thought of this child, this girl who'd hugged him like he was someone worth trusting, returning to that cold, lonely place made his jaw clench. "Of course," he heard himself say. The drive took 4 minutes. It would reshape the rest of his life. The blue apartments looked worse up close. Graffiti tagged the entrance, and 2 of the security lights were shot out. Min-soo's trained gaze catalogued exits, blind spots, vulnerabilities, old habits. The building would be a nightmare to defend if anyone wanted access, which meant Dahlia, small, trusting Dahlia, was completely exposed. "It's apartment 3C, she said, already unbuckling her seatbelt. The hail had stopped, leaving behind a crystalline layer of ice that made everything gleam under the streetlights. "Thank you again, Mr. Kang." Mr. Kang, no one called him that. It was always boss, or harangi, or sir with an edge of fear. Never mister, never with that particular note of childish formality. "I'll walk you up." It wasn't a question. His driver, Jay, who'd been with him for a decade, caught his eye in the rearview mirror. Min-soo could read the concern there. They had a meeting in 20 minutes with suppliers who'd flown in from Vancouver. This detour had already made them late. Min-soo didn't care. Inside, the building smelled of old cooking oil and desperation. The elevator was broken, so they took the stairs. Dahlia chattered as they climbed, her earlier fear dissolving into a stream of consciousness about school, her friends, how she'd wanted to see if the ice would make patterns when it hit the ground. Min-soo listened, a strange tightness forming in his throat. When had he last had a conversation that wasn't coded with threats or negotiations? Apartment 3C's door was thin enough to kick through. Min-soo's fingers twitched toward the lockpick set he always carried, the professional assessment automatic. 2 deadbolts, both cheap. A child could bypass them with a library card. Dahlia produced a key from under her shirt, strung on a shoelace around her neck. She unlocked the door and pushed it open to reveal a small apartment, kept meticulously clean despite its age. Second-hand furniture arranged with care, textbooks stacked neatly on a coffee table, photos on the wall, Dahlia with a woman who shared her eyes, both of them laughing. But the place was freezing and empty. "Mom works nights," Dahlia said, reading his expression with unsettling accuracy. "She's a nurse at Harborview. She'll be home around 7 in the morning." The girl glanced at a clock on the microwave. "That's 9 more hours." 9 hours. This child had 9 hours alone in a building with broken security, in a neighborhood where Min-soo's own people ran protection rackets because the cops barely bothered to patrol. His hands curled into fists. "Do you do this every night?" The question came out harsher than intended. Dahlia shrugged, suddenly defensive. "I'm not a baby. I know how to lock the door and not answer for strangers. Mum says I'm real mature for my age." Mature, Christ, she was 10. She should have been worried about homework and cartoons, not survival protocols. Min Su's phone buzzed. Jay, no doubt wondering if he'd been kidnapped. The Vancouver suppliers were notoriously punctual and dangerously prideful. Missing this meeting could cost them their primary pipeline, hundreds of thousands in revenue, possibly a small war if they took offense. He looked at Dahlia, already moving to turn on the space heater in the corner, because apparently the building's heating system was as functional as its security. Have you eaten? Another question he shouldn't be asking. I had crackers after school. Dahlia brightened. Want to see my room? I have a poster of Serena Williams. Mum says I could be just like her if I work hard. Crackers. One meal of crackers. And she was smiling about posters. Min Su's jaw worked. He thought about the meal he'd just left at his restaurant, $200 worth of premium Korean barbecue that he'd barely touched. He thought about his penthouse kitchen, perpetually stocked with ingredients his chef prepared. He thought about how easily a child this brave, this resilient, could disappear into the same system that had almost swallowed him. Show me your room, he said. Then I'm ordering you real food. Dahlia's face lit up like Christmas. Really? Really? Min Su pulled out his phone and sent a single text to Jay. Cancel the meeting. Reschedule for tomorrow. Priority change. The response was immediate. Boss, are you sure? The Canadians won't... Min Su cut him off with another message. I said priority change, handle it. He'd built an empire on calculated risks and cold decisions. He'd walked away from family, from any chance at normal relationships, from every soft thing that might have made him weak. For 20 years, nothing had been more important than power, respect, survival. But standing in this cold apartment, watching a 10-year-old girl point excitedly at a poster of a tennis champion, Min Su realized his priorities had just shifted, and he didn't want them back. Over the next 2 weeks, Min Su's life split into parallel tracks that should never have intersected. By day, he remained Horangi, the tiger who controlled Seattle's Korean underground with an iron fist wrapped in expensive suits. He negotiated territory disputes, approved shipments, collected debts. He attended his legitimate business's board meetings, smiled for the society photographers at charity galas, and maintained the perfect facade of a successful immigrant businessman. By night, he became something he didn't have a name for yet. It started with food. That first night, he'd ordered from his restaurant, proper Korean comfort food that arrived in his private car, delivered by his chef who'd asked no questions when Min Su explained it was for a friend's daughter. Dahlia had attacked the bulgogi and japchae with the enthusiasm of someone who'd survived on crackers too long. The next night, he'd found himself driving back to the Blue Apartments, this time with leftovers from a business dinner. And the night after that, and the one after that. Dahlia never asked him to come, never demanded anything. She simply accepted his presence with the same easy trust she'd shown in his car, filling the silence with stories about school and dreams of becoming a lawyer someday, like in the TV shows, but I'd defend people who can't afford the fancy ones. Min Su found himself listening, actually listening, not just cataloging information for leverage. He learned that Dahlia's father had died when she was 3, car accident, drunk driver. That her mother worked 70-hour weeks trying to keep them housed and fed. That Dahlia was top of her class despite everything. Fueled by a determination to make her mama proud, he learned that she was terrified of thunderstorms, but loved the rain. That she wanted a dog more than anything, but their building didn't allow pets. That her favorite color was purple, because it's like blue and red had a baby and the baby is royalty. Things Min Su had no use for. Information that earned him nothing. And yet he hoarded every detail like treasure. His crew noticed the changes. Jay, loyal to a fault, said nothing when Min Su started leaving meetings early. But Young Ho, his second in command, had questions. You're distracted, Young Ho said during a supply inventory check at the warehouse. The men are talking. Min Su didn't look up from the ledger. Let them talk. They're saying you've gone soft, that you missed the Vancouver meeting for a woman. Young Ho's voice dropped. If there's a security concern, we need to know. A woman. Min Su almost laughed. If only it were that simple. There's no security concern. Then what? Young Ho pressed. Boss, you've been different. The old you would have put a bullet in someone for suggesting we reschedule the Canadians. Now you're… Careful. The word came out quiet. Dangerous. Min Soo finally met Young Ho's gaze, and his lieutenant had the good sense to step back. I'm still the same person who built this organization from nothing. Still the same person who'll bury anyone who threatens it. Don't confuse growth with weakness. But driving to the blue apartments that night, Min Soo wondered if Young Ho had a point. Not about weakness. Min Soo could still kill without hesitation if necessary. But something fundamental had shifted. The empire he'd built suddenly felt hollow compared to the warmth of Dahlia's smile when he knocked on her door. Tonight, she greeted him with barely contained excitement. Guess what? Mom has Saturday off. She said she'll make her special pancakes for breakfast. Dahlia paused, suddenly shy. Would you… if you're not busy, would you want to meet her? Min Soo's chest constricted. Meet the mother. The woman who'd warned her daughter about men like him. The nurse who'd probably recognize his face from news reports about alleged organized crime figures. Meeting her would force this thing, whatever this was, into the light. Make it real. Make it something he couldn't quietly walk away from when reality inevitably intruded. He should have said no. Should have started extracting himself now before anyone got hurt. Before Dahlia's trust became a weapon someone could use against him. Before he forgot who and what he was. I'd like that, he heard himself say. What time? Dahlia's face transformed. She launched herself forward, arms wrapping around his waist, in a hug that had become their ritual greeting. Min Soo's hands settled on her shoulders with less awkwardness than the first time. Progress, he supposed. 9 o'clock, she said into his chest. And Mr. Kang, thank you. For everything. For coming back. For coming back. As if there'd been any question. As if Min Soo had any choice anymore. He'd spent 2 decades building walls around himself, brick by bloody brick. Turned himself into something hard enough to survive in a world that crushed soft things. He'd become untouchable, unreachable, alone by design. And a 10-year-old girl with beaded hair and a gap-toothed smile had demolished every defense in 14 days. Saturday morning arrived with crystalline clarity. Min Soo dressed carefully, not his usual 3-piece armor, but dark jeans and a simple black sweater. Still expensive, but less obviously so. He left his Rolex at home, wore a cheaper watch. Tried to look like someone Keisha Brooks might not immediately identify as a threat. The attempt was futile. He realized it the moment Dahlia's mother opened the door. Keisha Brooks stood maybe 5'6", whip-thin from overwork, with Dahlia's intelligent eyes and a spine of pure steel. She took one look at Min Soo, catalogued the tiger tattoo barely visible above his collar, the too-perfect posture, the unconscious way he'd positioned himself to see both the hallway and apartment interior, and her expression shuttered. "Mom, this is Mr. Kang." Dahlia appeared at her mother's elbow, oblivious to the sudden tension. "The one I told you about, who saved me from the hailstorm." "I remember." Keisha's voice was carefully neutral. Professional. The same tone she probably used on patients whose injuries told stories they weren't ready to share. "Mr. Kang, please come in." The apartment smelled of vanilla and cinnamon. Keisha had transformed the cramped kitchen into something almost festive. Pancakes stacked high, fresh fruit arranged in a cheap plastic bowl, orange juice in mismatched glasses. Probably more than they usually had for a week's worth of breakfasts, Min Soo thought. Prepared for a guest. For him. The guilt was immediate and sharp. Breakfast started awkwardly. Dahlia chattered, filling silences, while Keisha watched Min Soo with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easy smiles and expensive clothes. Min Soo didn't blame her. In her position, he'd be twice as suspicious. "Dahlia tells me you've been bringing her dinner," Keisha said finally, setting down her fork. "That's very kind." The words were pleasant. The eyes were not. "She mentioned being hungry," Min Soo replied. "I own several restaurants. It wasn't an inconvenience." Still, Keisha's gaze didn't waver. Men don't usually take interest in other people's children without a reason. Dahlia looked between them, confusion creeping into her expression. Min-soo felt something twist in his chest. This was the moment. He could lie, deflect, retreat back into his carefully constructed world, or he could— "You're right to be suspicious," he said quietly. "I know who I am, what people say about me." He touched his neck tattoo deliberately. "I'm sure you've heard the stories." Keisha's jaw tightened. "I work in an ER in this neighborhood, Mr. Kang. I know exactly who you are." "Mom?" Dahlia's voice was small, worried. Min-soo raised a hand, keeping his eyes on Keisha. "Then you know I have no good reason to be here. No angle, no leverage to gain from a 10-year-old girl and her overworked mother." He paused, searching for words that felt impossibly foreign on his tongue. "I pulled your daughter out of danger because she needed help. I keep coming back because—" "Because why?" He hardly understood it himself. "Because she reminds you of someone," Keisha supplied, still guarded but with a flicker of something else in her expression. Understanding, maybe. "No." The answer surprised him with its certainty. "She doesn't remind me of anyone. She's just—" Min-soo looked at Dahlia, who was watching him with those enormous trusting eyes. "She's extraordinary, and she deserves better than crackers for dinner and 9 hours alone every night." The silence that followed felt weighted. Keisha's hands had curled into fists on the table. When she spoke, her voice cracked slightly. "You think I don't know that? You think I want this for her?" Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "I work 70 hours a week. I pick up every extra shift they'll give me. And it's still not enough for a bigger apartment in a safer building with heat that actually works. It's not enough for a babysitter. It's not enough for—" Her voice broke. "Mom." Dahlia moved to her mother's side, small hand on her arm. "It's okay. We're okay." But they weren't. Min-soo could see it clearly now, the exhaustion carved into Keisha's face. The way this apartment, clean as it was, couldn't hide the water damage in the corners or the draft coming through windows that didn't quite seal. The desperation of a mother trying to give her child a life while drowning in the attempt. He'd seen that look before. In his own mother's eyes, years ago. Before the hunger and the cold and the exhaustion had finally taken her. Before Min-soo had been old enough to do anything but watch. Not again. The thought crystallized with perfect clarity. Not this time. What if I could help? The words were out before he fully thought them through. Keisha looked up sharply. "I'm not taking charity from a—" She cut herself off, glancing at Dahlia. "Not charity, an arrangement." Min-soo's mind raced, assembling pieces into a plan. "I have a property, a house in Madison Park, fully furnished, empty. My businesses pay for its upkeep anyway, tax purposes." True, though he'd planned to sell it. "You and Dahlia could live there, no rent." "Absolutely not." "In exchange," Min-soo continued, "you'd let me continue bringing Dahlia dinner on your work nights and—" He paused, the next words feeling too vulnerable, too honest. "And you'd let me be part of your lives, however you're comfortable with that looking." Keisha stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. "You want to give us a house so you can have dinner with my daughter?" "Yes. That's insane." "Probably." Min-soo met her disbelief steadily. "But I'm serious. And before you assume ulterior motives, understand this. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. The house means nothing to me financially. But Dahlia—" He stopped, struggling to articulate something he barely understood himself. "She matters. I can't explain why, but she does. And I'm in a position to help. So let me." Keisha studied him for a long moment, this dangerous man at her kitchen table making impossible offers. Finally, she spoke. "If I even consider this, I need to know one thing, and I need the truth." She straightened her spine. "Are you going to hurt us?" Min-soo thought about all the people he'd hurt, all the violence he'd committed, sanctioned, orchestrated. He thought about the empire built on fear and blood, about Young-ho's concerns about his distraction, about the 100 ways this could end badly. Then he looked at Dahlia's hopeful face and felt something ancient and fierce awaken in his chest, the same instinct that had sent him running into that hailstorm. Not the killer he'd become, but something older, something paternal and protective that he thought he'd buried with his grandmother. "No," he said, and meant it with every cell in his body. "I'd die first." The transition happened faster than Min Soo expected. Keisha, once she'd made her decision, proved as decisive as any general he'd worked with. She had conditions, extensive background checks, which Min Soo passed because his legitimate businesses were genuinely clean, a formal lease agreement which he had his lawyers draft, and absolute transparency about his schedule and whereabouts when it came to Dahlia. Min Soo agreed to everything, signed papers, opened his life to scrutiny he'd never allowed before, and watched as Dahlia and Keisha moved from the blue apartments to a 4-bedroom house in Madison Park with a yard, working heat and a security system that made Fort Knox look amateur. The first night in the new house, Dahlia FaceTimed him from her bedroom, her own bedroom which she'd spent hours decorating with Keisha's help. "Mr. Kang, look." She spun the phone around, showing off purple walls, new furniture, and a bookshelf already filling with books. "Mom says I can get a dog, a real dog." Min Soo, sitting in his penthouse alone with a glass of whiskey, felt his throat tighten. "What kind of dog?" "We're going to the shelter next week. Mom says I can pick." Dahlia's excitement was infectious. "Will you come with us? Please? I want you to meet whoever I choose." "Of course." The words came easily now. "Text me when and I'll be there." After they hung up, Min Soo sat in the dark for a long time, staring at Seattle's glittering skyline. Young Ho had been right about one thing. He was different. The man who'd built this empire would never have made himself vulnerable like this, would never have tied his safety to 2 people who could be used against him. And Min Soo didn't care. Let his enemies come, he'd destroy anyone who threatened them. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Min Soo had dinner at the Madison Park house 3 nights a week, scheduled around Keisha's shifts and his business obligations. He taught Dahlia to make bibimbap, correcting her technique with the same patience he'd never shown his subordinates. He helped with homework, discovering she was frighteningly smart and asking questions he sometimes had to research to answer. And slowly, carefully, he built a relationship with Keisha too. Not romantic, that wasn't what either of them needed, but something equally important: trust, mutual respect, the understanding of 2 people who'd both survived by being hard, now learning to be soft. One evening, after Dahlia had gone to bed, Keisha poured them both coffee and sat across from Min Soo at the kitchen table. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need honesty." Min Soo nodded. "What happens when this ends? When you get bored, or your life gets complicated, or Dahlia stops being the novelty she is now?" Keisha's voice was steady, but he could hear the fear beneath. "She loves you. You're the closest thing to a father she's ever had. So I need to know, are you in this for real? Or are we going to have to rebuild her when you leave?" The question deserved careful consideration. Min Soo thought about the life he'd built, the calculated risks, the exit strategies he maintained for every operation, how he'd never committed to anything he couldn't walk away from. Then he thought about Dahlia, showing him her report card with pride, about teaching her to defend herself because the world was dangerous and she needed to be ready, about the way she'd started calling him something that sounded suspiciously close to Dad when she was excited. "I met with my lawyer last week," he said quietly. "Had him draw up paperwork, guardian designation in case anything happens to you, financial trust for Dahlia's education and future, emergency contact authorizations." He met Keisha's shocked gaze steadily. "I'm not going anywhere. Ever. If you'll have me." Keisha's eyes filled with tears. She didn't bother hiding them this time. "She asked me yesterday if it was okay to love you, if that made her disloyal to her real dad." A sob broke through. "I told her her heart was big enough for everyone. That love doesn't run out." "It doesn't," Min Soo agreed, his own voice rough. "And for what it's worth, I'd be honored to stand beside her father's memory, not replace him, just be here, however she needs me to be." They talked until late that night, building the framework of an unconventional family. Minsu explained his world honestly, the dangers, the precautions, why certain people couldn't know about them. Keisha shared her own fears, her dreams for Dahlia, her cautious hope that maybe this strange arrangement could work. 6 months later, Minsu stood in Dahlia's new room, still purple but larger now, in the even bigger house he'd bought for them in Queen Anne because Keisha had mentioned wanting a garden, and watched her sleep. A rescue mutt named Thunder, chosen because he's protective like you. Mr. Kang sprawled across the foot of her bed. The tiger tattoo on his neck felt different now, not a symbol of violence, but of protection, the fierce guardian who'd do anything, absolutely anything, to keep this child safe. His phone buzzed. Young Ho, with the numbers from their latest venture. Minsu responded quickly, then silenced the phone. Business could wait. It would always be there. But Dahlia had a science fair project tomorrow, and he'd promised to help her rehearse her presentation one more time in the morning. He'd built an empire, commanded an organization, survived 2 decades in a world that killed soft things, but nothing had ever mattered more than this. Minsu turned off the light and headed downstairs, where Keisha was grading papers at the kitchen table. She looked up as he entered, smiled that tired but genuine smile, and gestured to the coffee pot. 1 cup won't kill you, she said, though fair warning, Dahlia wants to practice her speech at 6 a.m. sharp. I'll be here, Minsu replied. And he would be. Tomorrow, and the day after. And every day these 2 extraordinary people would have him. A killer who'd learned to love. A tiger who'd finally found what was worth protecting. The courtroom was smaller than Minsu expected, warmer. Judge Martinez, a stern woman in her 60s who'd reviewed every page of his background check with the thoroughness of an FBI investigation, sat behind the bench with an expression that gave away nothing. Beside him, Dahlia squeezed his hand. 13 now, tall and confident, with her mother's spine and something of his own fierce determination. Keisha sat on his other side, holding legal documents that would change everything. Mr. Kang, Judge Martinez said, this is a highly unusual situation. You understand that adoption creates a permanent legal relationship. It's not something done lightly. I understand, Your Honor. Minsu's voice was steady. He'd faced down federal agents, rival bosses, situations where one wrong word meant death, but nothing had ever felt as important as this moment. And you, Miss Brooks? The judge turned to Dahlia. Do you understand what this means? That Mr. Kang would become your legal father? Dahlia didn't hesitate. He already is, Your Honor. We're just making it official. Judge Martinez's stern expression cracked slightly. She glanced at the file one more time. 3 years of documentation, testimonials from teachers and counselors, proof of Minsu's transformation from the man he'd been to the father he'd become. Then she looked at the 3 of them, this unconventional family forged in a hailstorm. Very well. She signed the document. Congratulations, Mr. Kang. You're a father. Dahlia launched herself into his arms, and Minsu caught her with the practiced ease of years. Keisha hugged them both, tears streaming down her face. Happy tears, for once. Outside the courthouse, Thunder waited in the car with Minsu's driver, Jay, who'd become Uncle Jay somewhere along the way. The dog barked enthusiastically as they approached, tail wagging hard enough to shake the entire vehicle. Dad, Dahlia said, trying out the word officially for the first time. Can we get ice cream to celebrate? Dad. The title he'd never expected to earn, never thought he deserved, but hearing it from her lips felt like redemption. Of course, Minsu replied. Anything you want. And as they drove through Seattle's streets, his streets, where he was still the tiger, still dangerous when he needed to be, Minsu felt complete in a way no amount of power or wealth had ever achieved. The empire remained. The respect, the fear, the organization he'd built with blood and will. But none of it mattered as much as the girl in the back seat, planning her future with the confidence of someone who knew she was loved, protected, claimed by a man who'd once been a monster, and learned to be a father instead.